Hello, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Da'at Dargham. I use she, her pronouns. I am the South Asian, Southwest Asian, and North African Program Manager at UC Berkeley. Thank you again for joining us today. A special thank you to the amazing faculty that we have featured here today and tomorrow. And just wanted to let you know that this series has been brought to you by resource centers across the UC supporting South Asian, Southwest Asian, and North African students. Again, a special shout out to my colleagues at UC Riverside, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, and UC San Diego, and hopefully you all will be able to put a name to a face as we'll be moderating throughout these 3 days. Just a little bit of an intro as to what it is that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be focusing on a very brief consolidated history of Palestine, the connection of recent events in Sheikh Jarrah to the history of dispossession and occupation in Palestine, and the legal and political implications of US involvement. Tomorrow's series will be focusing on navigating censorship, lack of Palestinian advocacy, and techniques to sustain activism against oppression. And then our final event will be this Thursday. Again, these are all happening from 12 to 1. And it will be a processing space for how the recent events are affecting the Palestinian student community and its community of solidarity. And without further ado, I will be introducing, or I'll have our co-moderator introduce himself. So Ali, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Dua. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ali Sadat. I am the program coordinator for the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside. I'm really excited to be here. I'll go ahead and start off this event with the land acknowledgement that we read for UC Riverside, and then we can go ahead and introduce our esteemed faculty panelists for the day and go ahead and get ourselves started. So we at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. We also recognize that there is land in Palestine right now that is being taken and occupied, and that land is being taken and occupied in many different parts of the world. And if you're not joining us today from the Riverside area, we encourage you to educate yourself about the Native people from your area. Dua, would you like to move us on to the impact on communities?
Yes, and again, the lens that we're going to be examining today is through the settler colonial lens. And me, myself, I'm also working to better understand how I can also help Indigenous and Native populations. The approach that we take in our offices is one that focuses on intersectional struggle and working towards the collective liberation of all people. And so as we're discussing the impacts of Palestine today, there's also a lot of mobilization that's happening surrounding having the UC divest from the telescope at Mauna Kea. So I also encourage you as UC Thought Partners to be a part of that mobilization as well. So thank you again for that. And we're going to go ahead and introduce some of our phenomenal panelists for today. One of the panelists is Professor Samera Esmeir. She is the Associate Professor in the Department of Rhetoric at UC Berkeley. She is the author of Juridical Humanity, a Colonial History. She is currently working on a book manuscript on Palestine struggles titled The Struggle That Remains Between World and International. And she is the senior editor of the Critical Times, Interventions in Global Critical Theory.
Dr. Mark Levine is a professor of modern Middle Eastern history at UC Irvine. He has authored many books, including Overthrowing Geography, Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and the Struggle for Palestine, and Heavy Metal Islam. He is currently working on a book chronicling his travels through the Arab world in the last 5 years of uprisings and revolutions. He is also a professional musician and a senior columnist for Al Jazeera English, amongst other pursuits. And Dr. Baki Tezcan is a professor of history in the Middle East South Asia Studies program and history department at UC Davis. He was one of the founders of the Middle East South Asia Studies program, which he directed from 2012 to 2015. He has authored many publications, including The Second Ottoman Empire, political and social transformation in the early modern world. And he is the president of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, among other positions. Panelists, thank you all for joining us today.
Great. And so the first question is, a few weeks ago was the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba. Can you speak to the history of the Nakba and the ongoing catastrophic impact of the region?
I could pick this question up if you allow me, just to start only from sort of an Ottoman background. My specialty is in Ottoman history, and perhaps the important thing to underline here is the creation of Israel, a creation of a new state, was a catastrophe for the people who also were living there. So that kind of relationship between the creation of something new that unfolds and perhaps flourishes at the expense of something else, which experiences that as a catastrophe, unfortunately, is not unique in the region. The transition from empire to nation states created these kinds of situations all over the region, but perhaps the one that we witnessed in Palestine was one of the most striking ones. To give you just a little bit of background, the people who lived in the Ottoman Empire included many Jews, and for those Jewish people, the idea of Jewish nationalism, sort of a homeland for Jewish people in an imperial setting, was not a good one. On this particular slide, you see David Fresco. He was editor-in-chief of El Tiempo, a Ladino newspaper published in Constantinople in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he thinks the central leadership of Zionism is committing a huge crime in its desire to drag the Ottoman Jews after the crazy movement, for instance. Obviously, this question could take forever in a lecture, and we have only a few minutes to answer each one, so I'm going to be very quick here. During the First World War, we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, according to which the Allied powers sort of divided the Middle East among themselves as spheres of influence and directly ruled places, and among them, they in 1916 they had hoped it would become an international condominium. But their sort of vision for this land, you can tell from sort of anecdotes. Sykes, who was part of the Sykes, as in Sykes-Picot Agreement, when we see him in his chapel after his death, he's depicted as a crusader knight with a figure representing Arabs fallen under his feet right here. When we look at British general entering Jerusalem, he says the Crusades ended now. So the stories like this abound and suggest that for the people who came to Jerusalem, to Palestine, they had certain plans perhaps in mind, and those plans, some of them came to be unfolded right before they even entered Jerusalem. In November 1917, we have the Bulper Declaration, and this is the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom at the time, and he promised a homeland for Jewish people in Palestine that they were about to take under their control. The only Jewish member of parliament of the United Kingdom at the time, Sir Edwin Montagu, actually objected to this idea. And I should also underline, at this point in time, at the Ottoman parliament, there were actually two Jewish representatives, one representing Baghdad, the other Istanbul. Most of the Jewish population of the Ottoman Empire used to live in Salonika, which came under modern Greece. And then the other major centers were Istanbul, Baghdad. Of course, there were Jewish people in Palestine, but in terms of numbers, they were a very small minority. And the American commission that was sent there in 1919 very clearly could see that in order to create a Jewish homeland, there had to be use of arms and violence. The population of Palestine, the demographic constitution of Palestine changed drastically under British mandate after 1918 when the British took over. You can observe here how the immigration to Palestine from the diaspora into Palestine increased and brought Jewish population to close to 1/3, but still only 1/3 of the population. And what happened when the United Nations agreed to sort of divide the nation, the land, and then create two entities there? One of the things they also did was not to really take any kind of ideas to fore about how to secure that. Another thing that is very visible in the things that are going on is the Western nations, even though they knew a lot of things were going to happen in Germany as soon to the Second World War as 1938, they did not do anything about increasing Jewish immigration to their homelands. Everybody just showed toward Palestine. To go there was the sort of general sense at the end of the Second World War. The great documentary called Creation and Catastrophe tells what happened so well that I picked a few sections from there, but I'm not going to show all of them because that will take time away from others. I will only leave you with one little vignette that really tells the story so clearly.
There were Arabs standing between Lud and Ramle and crying they want to get back to their homes, and I could do nothing. And I felt very strongly about it because I saw them standing there, no shoes, and now they have to start walking and looking for someplace else. Then came the night, and at night, I don't know how many, 15 or 16 or maybe 10, I can't remember, trucks full of people that just came on the ship from the Holocaust. And they took over the town in 5 minutes. And so the whole tragedy was there in one moment. Here are the Arabs who used to live there, and here people who come from the Auschwitz and Majdanek and all that. And they took the city. And the Arabs had to go to Nablus and to Jenin and it's not that it's right or wrong, but it's just a fact.
I'll leave you with that for now.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up here and maybe take a position and say it is wrong. And add perhaps that just following up on what Baki was saying is that, I mean, what we really get this is then sense from Baki's presentation that the Nakba is not the beginning, but is the culmination really of Zionist settlement in the land of Palestine, supported by the British. Zionist project that started earlier in the 19th century. And the Nakba crucially resulted in the mass expulsion of the majority of Palestinians. 750,000 to 1 million were expelled either by Zionist militias or later by Israeli forces during the first year of Israel's creation when it was still fighting Palestinians and Arab armies. Today we have, of those 1 million, approximately 750,000 to 1 million. Today we have about 7.1 million Palestinians who are refugees in the world. The majority are either living in the West Bank or Gaza or neighboring Arab countries. During the Nakba, or during the war, the war of conquest, as I think we should call it, more than 400 Palestinian localities, villages and towns were destroyed and then later resettled by Israeli Jewish settlers. And this occurred also after the creation of the state, lasted into 1950, inhabitant of villages. And it's important to point out that this didn't cease with the war. My parents' village was bombarded in 1950, and they stood on another hill watching the bombardment of their village after they have been depopulated and evacuated from the land. So, but what is really important to understand is, intentional or not, the Nakba guaranteed the creation of a Jewish majority in the part that was claimed as Israel. Through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and destruction of social relationships and sites of life, Israel made its very foundation possible. As Baki mentioned, the 1947 UN partition plan divided the land of Palestine into two states, Israel and a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Even then, the Jewish state was supposed to get 55% of the land and the Palestinian state 42% of the land, and Jerusalem was to be internationalized. During the war, however, Zionist and Israeli forces were able to capture 78% of historic Palestine. The remainder, the West Bank, Gaza, the West Bank and Gaza were only 22%, including, of course, East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. Palestinians who remained inside 48, inside the new established state, lived, and they were a small minority, lived under military rule until 1966. Military rule secured the confinement of Palestinians to their villages, while Israel embarked on what it called the Judaization of the land. That is the takeover of Palestinian land and the establishment of settlements and towns and various kinds of posts on the land. And the main aim was Judaization. The confinement of Palestinians to their towns through the while they lived under the military regime, what it guaranteed is that they guaranteed that they also can't be on their land. And therefore the act of, and it's a long legal story, but the act of confiscation would become more possible. With the 1967-4, which is the second episode, if you will, of that started in the 1948, the rest of Palestine was occupied. That is, the West Bank and Gaza were occupied. Settlement activity would also now move to the West Bank and Gaza, and but primarily in the West Bank, where it's considered the heart of the land of Israel, the biblical land of Israel. The state governed these populations through different identities. Citizens, 1948, the Palestinians who stayed in the 1948 borders became citizens, would become citizens. Those occupied in 1967 would be subjects, and Jerusalemites would become residents. That is equivalent to a person with a green card. That is not, they would lose legally, their connection to the land would be completely eliminated, and instead they would gain the status of an immigrant. Not that immigrants should have any tentative status, but in Jerusalem, this is what Jerusalemites have, the status of someone with a green land and a green card, even though they are the indigenous people of the land. Palestine then was not occupied in 1948, and it's really important to remember this, and I think I will be repeating this over and over again today. It was not only occupied, it was disappeared, and really it's important to pay attention to that. And when we call it historical Palestine, perhaps we're conceding to that disappearance. We're saying historic, it used to be. Palestine was disappeared, and the recent event we've been witnessing, and also many before that, were acts of reappearance, were acts of insistence on a struggle against the disappearance of Palestine in 1948. The reason why Palestinians inside 48 who became citizens, Israel would call them Israeli Arabs, or Israel's Arabs, actually. For a direct Hebrew translation would be Israel's Arab, yes, yeah, Israel Arab. So it's as if they're the possession of the state, and they're called the Arabs in order to eliminate entirely their Palestinianness. Some say that this is because Israel wanted to Israelize them, that is to eliminate their Palestinianness and to turn them into Israelis. But that would be only part of the story. The other part of the story is really for Israel to be assured that there are no Palestinians on this land, that this land is no longer Palestinian. So by reclassifying them and renaming them as Israeli Arabs, there is that wishful, the practice of wishful disappearance, of we wish them away by classifying them as something else, with the hopes that they too will forget who they are and what the land is. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Professor, and both of you. This has been really interesting for me, who's worked on this for over 30 years, to learn and relearn some of these important facts. In fact, some of the quotes I know, some I haven't seen before. I guess what this brings to mind really is what I call a discourse of erasure and reinscription. And in order for Palestine, a country that was so populated that one British official said, it's so populated you can't even swing a cat. That was the colorful phrase, without hitting a Palestinian, which is why he was so shocked that Jews thought they could come and simply take over the country. Well, when you have a country that's so populated you can't swing a cat without hitting one of the indigenous population, the only way you're going to convert that country into a country belonging to another population that isn't indigenous and isn't even there yet, really, when you're putting this plan into place, is to get rid of the indigenous population. There's simply no other way. Going back to Herzl, he talked about spiriting the indigenous inhabitants across the border, and we see this as part of the Zionist idea from the very beginning. So, but in order to do this, you can't just, and this is where I think Professor Esmeir's point is so valid. 48 is the result of a half-century long process, but not just a physical process, not just slowly buying land, taking over land, removing the indigenous inhabitants. It's also an ideological process. It's a spatial process. It's creating towns like Tel Aviv, like Rishon LeZion, like the kibbutzim, that were exclusively Jewish, were suddenly Palestinians who might have used the land for centuries for grazing or farming, or lived there until the land was sold out from under them by absentee landlords, to make this land now something they no longer had access to do. And this happened nowhere more so, in fact, than in the area around Jaffa and Tel Aviv. I mention that only because when the last violence was happening, I mean, violence is always happening, but when the big explosion of violence of the last few weeks was happening, one of the centers was in Jaffa, and you had roving bands of extremist Jews going around and attacking Arabs. You had some Palestinian youth who were also attacking Jews. And this is not surprising to someone who's spent any time researching the history of Jaffa and Tel Aviv. In fact, the first great revolt, or Thawra, in Palestine was 1921, and it started in Jaffa, not far from the areas where the violence was today. And a mosque was actually built in the neighborhood of Manshia, which is still there, Hassan Bey Mosque. Anyone who's been to Jaffa, Tel Aviv knows the mosque along the beach. It was put over a kilometer away from the old city, precisely to put that land into a waqf, so that Jews couldn't buy the land and basically surround and close off Jaffa. So this is a long-term process. And when the gentleman in the video that Professor Tezcan showed at the end says, you know, it just happened so suddenly, if it was sudden at the moment, but there was decades of planning, of efforts working with the British, working against the British, finding collaborators within Palestinian communities, using all kinds of methodologies, town planning and others to achieve this, that laid the groundwork to make pushing out 70,000, 90% of 70,000 inhabitants of Jaffa, something that could happen literally in a matter of days in 1948 during the war. So, the other crucial thing to point out here, and this is where the idea of apartheid really fits, even though it's historically unique, but the idea of a long-term system of racialized exclusion and political and economic and territorial marginalization and replacement, why that fits here is because the techniques and strategies developed in the pre-48 period were carried over into what became Israel after 1948, and it was used to marginalize and control the Palestinian citizens of Israel under military occupation, but even after, right? And once the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem were conquered, never mind Golan Heights, which is in some ways part of the story, but also its own story. Once they were conquered, right, and also the Sinai, but once the main part of historic or Mandate Palestine was conquered, these techniques were deployed yet again and refined even further. And as they were refined and even further and deployed even more intensively as Israelis began to settle the West Bank and also Gaza and of course East Jerusalem, those technologies were then brought back across the Green Line and then refined and deployed even further as in the process, as Professor Esmeir pointed out, of Judaization, Yehud in Hebrew, of the territory and official government policy, whether it's in the Galilee, whether it's in Jaffa, whether it's in Nazareth, Nazareth Elite area above Nazareth, where they engaged in very specific programs of surrounding Palestinian towns, taking over the land, putting Jewish suburbs in that would slowly choke off the Palestinian towns. Same exact thing they do, of course, if you go to any Palestinian town in the West Bank, which might be Area A, but it's surrounded usually by hills, rings with Zionist settlements, right? Or Israeli settlements whose goal is to choke them off and ultimately take the land. You could see that in Nablus. You could see that in like a little beautiful town like Borin in the Nablus region, which was so viciously attacked during the current fighting. You could see it in the South Hebron Hills. You can see it all over East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah. So this is a strategy that is not 50 years, it's not 70 years, it's over 100 years, right? The first exclusively Jewish town, Tel Aviv, was created in 1909. It's the same year the first kibbutz, Degania, was created in 1909. So this goes back really to this moment, as Professor Gershon Shafir of UC San Diego so famously put it, in that very year when Zionism became a militant nationalist movement. And instead of just conquering the economy, instead of just trying to create a Jewish economy that could thrive in Palestine, it realized the only way it could do that would be to conquer the land. And so only by controlling land and removing Palestinians from the land they controlled could the Zionist movement then create an economy that would be able to sustain the Jews that they hoped were coming. And so that's the dynamic that's there in 1909 or 2019, right? And I think we need to consider this when we look at the current dynamics, because it's still what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah. It's still controlling territory and limiting Palestinian access is what the siege of Gaza is about. It's what the surrounding of Jerusalem with a belt of settlements is about. It's about why Area A is completely surrounded by areas B and C where Palestinians have no control. And it's about why, where you can almost say a kind of quantum physics is in place, whereby any time a Palestinian moves through the territory, as she or he moves, that territory becomes securitized. And it becomes a space where a Jew or a soldier or anyone can come and declare that a security risk and remove them. And anytime a Jew moves anywhere throughout the occupied territories, their mere presence changes the legal, the security, the economic, in every possible way, the status of that land, literally as they move through. And so the effectiveness of this is so great, it renders almost every possible means of protest, of resistance, whether it's nonviolent or violent, impossible. And that's really why we're in this situation where, despite so many efforts by international community, by solidarity movements, by local Palestinians to stop the onslaught of territorial expropriation, it continues to happen because the very structures make it almost impossible, given the disparity of power, for Palestinians, regardless of what methods they choose, to actually resist. And I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to all of you for providing us with that background. Kind of talking a little bit more about the present day, the forced dispossession of the people of Sheikh Jarrah has gained worldwide media attention. Why do you think this is? How is this uprising different from the past? And how is the resistance from both Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but also people worldwide? How is this different from the past? And I'll let anyone who would like to take that on to go ahead and get us started.
I have just a few maps to show that will illustrate what Samira and Mark already sort of underlined. If I can go with that, and then I'm going to keep it very short. My aim is simply to illustrate what has been said. So the Palestine and Jewish-owned land as of 46, 47 partition borders, and then this is the situation at the end of the war in 67. This is under Israeli occupation. This particular map comes from 2012. So this is what is left in Palestinian hands. And if you look at it more sort of closely on the West Bank map, you'll see everything that my colleague Mark was telling about how each area is surrounded by Jewish settlements. It becomes very clear in the area of East Jerusalem that has been annexed by Israel and not recognized internationally. You can see Jewish settlements all around. And now where the things have been happening, if you look more closely, Sheikh Jarrah is in this area. So this is a more Palestinian occupied area. And now what we see is encroachment, as Mark was saying, is one step at a time. Techniques that have been used at some point in one place are now carried over here, is what we see in the case of this family, for instance, in their home. And their story is so illustrative of what Mark was just saying. Her name is Samira too. Samira, the Janis family, they fled in 1948 from their home in Baka in what is now West Jerusalem. And they stayed in many different places, eventually settled in this house, and that is where she was raised. And now she's being asked to move out of there. As a person who lives in East Jerusalem, who might have had property in West Jerusalem, she cannot move back to that property because she cannot get that in the same way. The Palestinians are not allowed to get back their property from before 48. But if you happen to be Jewish, then even in territory that is West Bank, that is not supposed to be built with settlements, even there, Jewish people are able to bring claims to property rights from 48. And so this particular situation is so apparent, so clear what an injustice is happening. She has to move one more time at this stage of her life from the home that she only got as a result of another move because of expansion of Israeli control. And I'll stop right here.
Please.
Maybe I can actually dispute the question a bit. I don't think the Sheikh Jarrah's episode gained international media attention because it's Sheikh Jarrah. We've been having protests since the beginning of Ramadan and before that in Jerusalem and Bab al-Amud and Damascus Gate and in Sheikh Jarrah. In fact, as we're speaking, there are legal cases now against the Silwan populations. Hundreds of people are in East Jerusalem are being threatened of deportation, of evacuation, just as the Sheikh Jarrah folks are. And there is no international attention on that or media attention on that. I think we've received some. If there was any media attention, it was because of the activism of these amazing, really Jerusalemite activists who attempted really hard to bring their story to international attention. So that's one, but international media, mainstream media attention only started paying attention when Gaza got involved, because this is when they pay attention, when Israel strives in spectacular means to discipline Palestinians. So that sort of spectacular ritual that Israel engages every few years in the lesson doesn't reach Palestinians. Its audience apparently is the international community that then pays attention to what is happening in Palestine. And the aim was indeed to highlight Gaza, indeed meant to highlight what's happening in Jerusalem at the time. So unfortunately, Jerusalem wouldn't have received the same international public attention had Gaza not fired rockets and had Gaza not ended up suffering lives and sacrificing life. And so then to blame Palestinians for their armed resistance is really quite ironic when attention was paid only after the bombarding violence started and destruction started. But I want to add one more thing here, is that it's really important another point I want to add is really important not to think about history or events as just events that belong to their present moment. Events oftentimes belong to earlier presence as well, because they accumulate past struggles. And what we've seen in Palestine in the recent months is the accumulation of earlier struggles. So who actually paid attention to Jerusalem at the beginning? Who paid attention at the beginning? Those who paid attention and went out immediately to the streets were the Palestinian citizens inside the 48 borders, inside the Israel. So those are the ones who went out to the streets immediately in support, supporting the Jerusalem residents. And they did so before even anything happened actually in the West Bank. They were the first to pay attention to this. And they, in turn, did not just suddenly wake up one morning and decide to go and support Jerusalem during that moment in time. They also have their own history of supporting political work against settlement, opposition to settlement. In fact, the Hirak Haifa, the movement of the Haifa youth, that it has been really crucial in this entire affair, in this entire moment of opposition. They formed, one of their key moments of formation is there in opposition to what is known as the Prover Plan. That is the plan to resettle, to remove 70,000 Bedouins, Palestinian Bedouins from the Naqab, the Negev area. They live in 35 localities that Israel considers these localities to be unrecognized villages and therefore does not provide any services to these villages, even though these people were living on this land either before Israel was established or pursuant to a military order that Israel itself issued in 1950. So it's their land, they're sitting on it, they're living on it. So it's against, in opposition to what was called at the time the Prover Plan, that Hirak Haifa started, the youth in Haifa, the movement, Palestinian youth, started a series of protests and organization to oppose the displacement and the resettlement of the displacement of Bedouin Palestinians and the resettlement of their lands. And it is that struggle, formative struggle, that then continues to pick up years after and to repeat years after. And today, or last month, we saw it being repeated once again. It emerged once again, the movement emerged once again, this time in support of Sheikh Jarrah, and then later in support of Gaza. So what we have is then we must have that historical view, not a historical view that historicizes, but a historical view that looks to see continuities and how struggles accumulate, and how new alliances are formed, and how a fragmented people comes together at different points in time. And we've seen that in a quite intense way in the last 2 weeks, but we've seen that in perhaps less intense way, but visible for those who wanted to pay attention in the years before that.
If I could just add something, I went to my first Sheikh Jarrah demonstration in 2010. And it was already going on then. I bought a lovely T-shirt. It was about saving Sheikh Jarrah, which I thought I could find, but long gone somewhere. But this has been going on forever, right, in Sheikh Jarrah. I lived in Sheikh Jarrah, or in Wadi Joz, right below it, in the 90s when I was doing my PhD research. And there were already settlers moving in then, but before the wall, which we haven't really mentioned, but the apartheid security, whatever you want to call it, wall that was put up, was aimed to, first of all, cut off Sheikh Jarrah from Abu Dis and other areas that it used to feed into. You used to be able to go to Abu Dis on areas literally in 7-8 minutes if there wasn't much traffic. Now it could take 2 or 3 hours if you're even able to go. And so the idea of ultimately conquering Sheikh Jarrah, and it's one of the most important parts of the old city. It's a hill, it's up from East Jerusalem, it overlooks everything. It's where one of the most important Palestinian and other hotels, and Tony Blair has a house there, right? The quartet has a house there. So this is a place where where controlling it has a lot of symbolic value, and settlers have been moving in there really in the last 15, 20 years, especially. I'm sure many of us have friends there, right, in that neighborhood, and we know they are. And so we've seen it evolve. This is a long-term plan to Judaize that area. And I think what Professor Esmeir has pointed out is so important is that it doesn't matter how Palestinians resist, right? It's not as if the Israelis are saying, oh, please, if you resist nicer, we'll stop, right? It doesn't work that way. Whatever means are used to resist are met with violence. Nonviolence is met with violence. Language is met with violence. Civil disobedience is met with violence. Violence, when there's nothing left to do, is met with violence, because the goal is not to discipline or tame Palestinians so that they can then become good citizens or non-threatening citizens of their own state. The goal is to replace Palestinians and have as many Palestinians leave what remains of Palestine in the occupied territories as possible. Let us recall, I don't know the exact data these days, but a couple of years ago when I checked, tens of thousands of Palestinians leave the occupied territories every year because they simply can't take it anymore. And because of their education or family members, they have a way out. And most of those who leave, of course, are middle class, educated, etc. People who would be the so-called foundation of an independent state. This is also part of a plan. The ethnic cleansing doesn't just come in the big cases like Sheikh Jarrah. It comes by making life so difficult that people give up and leave. And when you do that year after year, decade after decade, you're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are leaving because they have no choice. And that's also part of the plan. So if you don't really, if you haven't lived there, if you haven't experienced the full, the full universe of techniques and strategies that Israel deploys every minute of every day, of every week, every month, of every year, of every decade since 1967, and in fact since the 1890s, but especially since 1909, when the settlement movement, really exclusively Jewish settlement movement, began in earnest, you simply can't understand that it is so suffocating, that there's literally nowhere to turn, nowhere to go, and no way you can do. It's literally like they are the Borg, and Palestinians, resistance. Their goal is to make resistance seem so futile that people give up, and most people leave, and those who there become like Palestinian citizens of Israel. That's clearly the goal. It's the stated goal. Right up in these last protests, when they had interviews with settlers saying Palestinians should just leave. What's the problem? Let them go somewhere else. That is the goal, and the government has been wholeheartedly in support of that since the moment of conquest in 1967, right? And let's recall, and with this, let us please remember that under international law, forget about whether Israel should have or was actually under a threat for its existence in 1967. It had a pretext to conquer the territories, we could say, under international law, given threats against it. Whether or not it should have is a different story. But there's one thing to conquer and impose a military occupation on a territory. There are frameworks in international law to have even a long-term military occupation. The moment you start moving civilian settlers into an occupied territory, you're committing a war crime. And the second you put them in as part of an enterprise to settle and change the demographic balance of that territory, you're committing a crime against humanity. So when Israel says that, oh, this is because of security, it's nonsense, because Israel could have kept the occupied territories under military occupation to this present moment in accordance to, at some level, with international law. But instead, it's been putting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of settlers there and seizing as much land as it possibly can. And these are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. This is not debatable. This is the textbook definition of a crime against humanity. And it is absolutely politicized. And one could argue it reaches the level at this point of incipient genocide. So, and certainly apartheid. And this is not a political claim. This is just a statement of fact based on the way international law defines what these terms mean. So the idea that this has ever been about security is a joke. It always has been. And the fact of these settlements, which are never going to leave, which are there for good, show what the intention was and show the complete illegality of the entire enterprise. And that is why this whole dream of two states, of Oslo, of all that was never going to happen. And what needs to happen instead is a recognition that there needs to be a joint struggle to create full human rights, full civil rights, full political rights for everyone living between the river and the sea. And at the same time, to enable a way for those who were expelled and pushed out or not let in after they left, legally, by the way, because of the fighting in 1948 and again in 67, to either return or be compensated or somehow have a stake in this land. That's got to be the way forward. And it's the only chance we might have to shift the balance of power somewhat away from the absolute imbalance that favors Israel at the moment.
Thank you all for your insight on those questions. And we kind of talked a little bit about this, but I'm wondering if the panelists can kind of go a little bit more in depth and talking about the conditions Palestinians are facing and how it looks different across the West Bank, Gaza, and different parts of Israel, if not maybe looking exactly the same. Can any of you all speak more to provide a context to the folks on this call of how they differ or how they don't?
I think I will be very, very brief because I know we have 12 more minutes left. So maybe just briefly, maybe just briefly to say that there are various policies and legalities that travel from one place to another. In particular, the land-related one, the settlement one. So they traveled. So confiscation. So today, 93% of the land is owned by the state of Israel. Only 7% of the land inside Israel, the borders of Israel proper. So only 7% of the land is privately owned. 3% of which, or 4%, I always confuse, is owned by Jewish citizens of the state. So only 3% of the land is really owned by Palestinians inside 48. This tells you then that there was a huge process of confiscation of land, of taking over, that started with the military takeover in 1948 or 1947 through 1949 to be more accurate, and continued through legal means and continues through legal means into the present. The same happened in the West Bank. Through military takeover and then through legal means, whether they're emergency regulations or whether they're normal law, take over the land in the West Bank and the building of settlements in Gaza and in the West Bank. The fact of the matter is, however, that there are these three different legal regimes, if you will, or 4 or 5 of them. In fact, the citizenship status binds Palestinians to the state through their citizenship. What it does is that it gives them a particular experience, right, of politics and of society, and therefore shrinks their political practice and their political vision for the future to just gaining minority rights. So through the citizenship status, Palestinians inside Israel were effectively minoritized and therefore got adrift, dismembered from the rest of the Palestinian people. So then you've created that group, a group with very specific aspirations of minority rights. And then you went to the West Bank and Gaza, and there they were occupied. So for a long while, it was the laws of war, the laws of occupation, I should say, not the laws of war, the laws of occupation that supposedly offered the legal framework for that space. And it was, for a long while, it was military rule that really, in practice, governed this population. Then what does the political project become? End the occupation. So you see immediately how by fragmenting, how you immediately fragmented the Palestinian people into 2 groups. And then, of course, you have the refugees that you do not allow them to return to begin with. So their right becomes human rights and right to return according to international law. And of course, you have the residents of East Jerusalem. They're neither citizen nor subjects, occupied subjects, they're residents. And then their legal and political struggle becomes one of maintaining their residency, because Israel constantly wants to confiscate Palestinians' residency in East Jerusalem, something we didn't talk about. So then you immediately see how those different legal regimes, 4 different legal regimes, and add to that Gaza and the siege, where then you have a besieged population demanding the lifting of the siege. So you see, you already have 5 different political projects. And what Israel does through that, it makes the Palestinian people impossible. It makes any kind of collectivity impossible, fragments different Palestinian demands, make each group working on its own, allows then each group to work on its own, of course, and it suppresses it as well. I mean, it doesn't accept that. And then through that fragmentation, which is not ununique, or it's not unique to a settler colony. Other settler colonies do that work of dismemberment and confinement, right? By confining in different enclaves, making the Palestinian people impossible. And that is what we have to focus on. And that is what we have to understand. It's not only a technology of dispossession, it's also a technology of dismemberment. And then that makes this moment difficult, because this is a moment of regathering and recollectivizing that brings all these different populations together, attempting to make something, to remake the Palestinian body. And at the same time, each group is really working from its own unique circumstances. And that's what makes this exercise even more difficult, because each is facing other mechanisms of control. So if in the West Bank, they're facing checkpoints and army soldiers on the checkpoints, inside Israel, they're facing police or border police sometimes, and arrests and intensified campaigns of arrests. About up to something less than 2,000 people were arrested in the last couple of weeks. So we see then arrests inside 48, because this is what you do with citizens. You just, mass arrest them. And you see in the West Bank actually shooting at the checkpoints. And you see in Gaza bombardment of a besieged territory. All of these are various technologies to deal with a fragmented population. But the other side of this is that this fragmented population is now refusing this fragmentation and reassembling itself, if you will, and recollectivizing itself. And we'll see what that will lead to.
I would just very briefly say, and I think those remarks are so crucial, the end of fragmentation. I wonder, I have no idea, but I wonder, did the Israeli government and planners and intelligence people think through that by pushing so hard they were going to reunite Palestinians across the Green Line into one people more than ever, since they had spent so long trying to keep them divided? And if so, do they either not care, they just feel so confident that it simply doesn't matter to them if they are united in this way? Or is it part of a larger strategy? If Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line are united increasingly and describe themselves as Palestinians, then the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens become the enemy now, or 5th column in the enemy, which they already generally presented as anyway on any given day. But now they really become the enemy, and that then justifies clearing them out. And let's remember that what we see in the occupied territories of settlements and penetration, in other words, Sheikh Jarrah is happening all over Israel. Mixed towns all over Israel, especially Lydda, especially Ramla, which were sites of big fighting during the violence last month. These are sites where extremist religious Jews, many of them who came from the occupied territories as settlers, are now going and using the same language to settle mixed neighborhoods and to penetrate them and to gradually make them more and more Jewish. And so the inside Israel now is becoming increasingly like the occupied territories, legally, spatially, discursively. And that, both creates opportunities for Palestinians to unite and to frame the entirety of Israel as an apartheid situation. So that at least makes that easier. But on the other hand, it frightens me as someone who thinks they are hoping to create such a nightmare that they can push They can push out, not just hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also within Israel.
Thank you all so much for your answers. We have 4 minutes left here. The final question, I apologize for asking you all to keep your answer for this brief, but organizers for the Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives have made clear that they stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their struggle. Just to bring this all back together, how are these two movements interconnected with each other?
I can begin to take that. I think there are many ways in which this, and given that we only have 4 minutes, I'm just going to recall what we had in the last few years here in the Bay Area, the campaign against Urban Shield in San Francisco and in Oakland. Urban Shield, if you, for those of you who don't know about it, is a police training, weekly. Once after the weekend of 9/11, different police forces come from different parts of the world to train police for in their campaigns of criminalization, marginalization, and repression. Israeli police participates in these campaigns. There was a huge coalition in the Bay Area that worked to stop Urban Shield from its deployment in the Bay Area, in particular in Oakland and San Francisco. So this is then something to remember, where we already had coalitions in the past between Black Lives Matters activists and other Black activists against policing and against ICE as well, activists who worked on questions of immigration, and various other activisms in the Bay Area. And these are real coalitions, so it's important to remember that these coalitions then form solidarities. Solidarities are not just ideal. They don't just emerge out of nowhere. It's actual work of activists on the ground who form coalitions and alliances in this country against, say, the exportation of Israeli policing and militarization technologies that forms coalitions, and it's important to remember that. I'll stop here because I just wanted to give it like a material example.
I would just very briefly say, what you're seeing with Black Lives Matter is the realization that there can be no such thing as a liberal white politics, that white liberalism simply fails, because white liberalism is just white racism with more excuses. And in the end, I'll just quote James Baldwin, if you still think you're white, there's no hope for you. In other words, whiteness is an ideology that is simply indefensible. It is an ideology and an identity that has emerged over half a millennium, almost entirely through hatred, through exploitation, slavery, genocide. And to still be white is to basically, is not a tenable identity for anyone who believes in racial justice. I think the same thing has happened now finally with Zionism. You cannot be a Zionist and be a liberal. You cannot be a Zionist and say you support anti-racism, because Zionism is explicitly racist at its core. It can't be anything other, because from the very start, it was based on conquering a territory, whatever your imagined or real historical rights from 2,000 years ago, that has an indigenous population, taking their land, replacing them, pushing them out. There's only one way to describe it. It's called racist and colonial. And so today, more and more, and I think you see this with young Jews and the rise of JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Ben the Ark, et cetera, et cetera. Even Peter Beinart, for God's sakes, is becoming anti-Zionist. So there's a huge move to realize that Zionism is just untenable, and the mask that you can be progressive except for Palestine, that you can be a liberal Zionist, is gone. What we see in Israel today and in the occupied territories is the reality of Zionism, and everyone has to choose. And of course, the fundamentalist evangelicals who, are going to choose Zionism because they're also largely racist and exclusivist. But the rest of us, especially Jews, younger Jews and real progressive Jews, and everyone else are going to have to come together to fight this, to give full human rights and dignity for everyone from the river, not just the river to the sea, from the other river, the river in Euphrates and Tigris, all the way to the other sea, to the Atlantic, because Israel and the conflict is just the core of a much bigger regime of war, of arms sales, of oppression, of human rights violations. Even if Israel wanted to be a moral country and get out of the occupied territories, it's too valuable being what it is, right? And that's what we are. I think the one thing we didn't talk about, which I hope we can another time, is that it is not the tail wagging the dog here. Israel is a very useful element in a larger system of global expropriation, global wealth concentration, and war and domination that is the bigger problem. And the plight of Palestinians is not going to be solved as long as we continue to support the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and this entire international regime where violence and domination are the rule instead of the exception.
I don't have much to add to these great remarks other than to say just perhaps it is not, as Mark so rightly pointed out, the story is all over the place. And I happen to be from Turkey, where I follow what's going on with Kurds. And what just recently happened after the Turkish army pushed into northern Syria, where there was a actually pretty democratic Kurdish regime established, it got to be replaced by Syrian Arabs who had gotten out of Syria for various reasons, and now Kurds there became a minority from being a majority at the time when they established that very democratic system. So it is important to remember the larger region is full of such regimes, but I guess what is happening in Palestine is so much more clearly showing the violence, the utmost violence where it can reach and injustice might go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, to the colleagues that helped put this event together, and for you all for attending. Just wanted to put a reminder that tomorrow we're having another action panel from 12 to 1, the same time, and it is going to focus on challenges around navigating censorship, lack of Palestinian advocacy, and sharing techniques to sustain activism against oppression. Thank you all again, and there is a survey that was put into the chat as well, and we hope that we can continue these solidarity efforts collectively in the future as well. Thank you.
Okay. Panelists, thank you all so much, and thank you so much to our attendees. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and you're able to join us tomorrow.
Thank you, guys. Great job. Salam.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.